There is a moment, right before someone decides to end their own life, when the whole world goes completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat and nothing else. Diane Whitfield remembers that silence better than she remembers most of her 46 years on this earth. She remembers sitting on the edge of her bathtub in a small house outside Dayton, Ohio, with a bottle of pills in her right hand and a folded piece of paper in her left. She remembers thinking that she had finally found the one decision in her life that nobody could talk her out of. She had already said her goodbyes, in her own head, to people who didn't know they were being said goodbye to. And then, at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon, her phone rang. This is a true story about a single word, not a speech, not a sermon someone gave her, not a support group pamphlet, not a therapist's carefully rehearsed line. One word, said at exactly the right second, by exactly the right person, on an ordinary Tuesday that was supposed to be Diane Whitfield's last. And that word saved her life. By the time this story is finished, you will know exactly what that word was, who said it to her, and why. Out of everything anyone had said to her, in the 11 months leading up to that afternoon, this was the one that reached her. But before you can understand why that word worked, you need to understand everything it was up against. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To everyone who knew her, Diane Whitfield looked like a woman who had it together. She taught 3rd grade for 19 years. She sang in the choir at her church on Sunday mornings. She kept a garden that her neighbors used to stop and admire on their evening walks. Nobody who saw her handing out worksheets or trimming her rose bushes could have guessed what was happening underneath all of it. That is the part of this story that still haunts the people who loved her. Not one person, not her sister, not her closest friend of 20 years, not even her own son, saw it building. She had gotten remarkably good at hiding it. And by the time anyone might have noticed, it was already far too late for the version of Diane they thought they knew to save herself. The unraveling did not begin with one event. It began with a slow accumulation of small losses that, on their own, nobody would have called a crisis. Her husband, Robert, had left 18 months earlier for a woman 12 years younger than Diane, someone he had met through work and had, for the better part of a year, insisted was nothing more than a friend. The divorce papers had only been finalized that spring. Diane still remembers the day Robert packed his car in their driveway, how he could not quite look at her, how he kept saying he was sorry, as if the word itself could undo 22 years of marriage. She stood on the porch and watched the car pull away, and told herself she would be fine. She told herself that for a very long time. Her son, Tyler, had moved across the country for a job less than a year later. A good opportunity, the kind of opportunity Diane had always told him to take if it ever came along. She remembers hugging him in the driveway the morning he left, remembers telling him she was proud of him, remembers meaning every word of it, even as something in her chest quietly broke. Their calls, at first, came every single day. Within a few months, they had become weekly. By the time summer arrived, Tyler's calls came sporadically, caught between long stretches of silence, usually rushed, usually distracted, usually ending with him promising to call again soon, and Diane telling him not to worry about her. She was fine. Then, that January, Diane's mother passed away after a short illness that nobody had expected to take her so quickly. Diane's siblings, both of them living out of state, told her they simply could not bear to help clean out the house their mother had lived in for 4 decades. So Diane did it alone, room by room, over the course of 3 exhausting weekends, sorting through a lifetime of photographs and letters and small objects that meant nothing to anyone but her mother, deciding what to keep and what to give away and what to quietly throw in the trash, because keeping it would have been too painful. Each of these losses, by itself, was survivable. Together, stacked one on top of another, with no space to breathe in between, they became something else entirely. By the time summer turned into fall, Diane Whitfield had stopped answering most of her calls. She told herself it was because she was tired from the school year. She told her sister it was because she needed some time alone to think. What she did not tell anyone, because she did not fully understand it herself yet, was that somewhere in the last year, The version of her that wanted to keep living had quietly gone missing, and nobody, including Diane, had noticed the exact day it happened. She kept teaching. She kept smiling at the grocery store. She kept showing up to choir practice on Wednesday nights. And every single night, alone in that house that used to be full of noise, she got a little closer to a decision she had been circling for months without saying it out loud, even to herself. There was one afternoon, back in March, when Diane almost let someone in. A coworker had mentioned a support group that met in the basement of a community church, a small gathering of people dealing with grief and depression, led by a woman named Patricia Hensley. Diane went once. She sat in the back row, said almost nothing for the full 90 minutes, and left before anyone could catch her name properly or ask for her number. She told herself she had only gone to be polite to her coworker, that groups like that were for people whose situations were far worse than hers. She never planned on going back. She had no way of knowing that a woman she had spoken maybe 4 sentences to that evening would end up being the reason she was still alive 7 months later. The specific afternoon it finally happened started like any other Tuesday in late September. Diane had graded papers until noon, made herself a cup of tea she never drank, and sat down at her kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. She sat there for nearly 2 hours before she wrote a single word. When she finally did write something, it wasn't an explanation. It wasn't even really a goodbye. It was 3 short lines, apologizing to people who, she had convinced herself, would be better off without the burden of her. She folded the paper in half, walked upstairs, and sat down on the edge of the bathtub with the bottle of pills her doctor had prescribed for sleep 6 months earlier, and had refilled twice since, without anyone asking why. What Diane did not know, what she could not have known, was that 400 miles away, in a small apartment in a Chicago suburb, Patricia Hensley had woken up that same morning with an uneasy feeling she could not explain. Patricia had a habit, one that some people in her life thought was excessive, of following up with people who came to her group only once and disappeared. She had never once been able to explain, even to herself, why she felt compelled to follow up with certain people and not others. But that Tuesday morning, Diane Whitfield's name would not leave her mind. She found the number Diane had left on an intake sheet back in March, a number she had never used, and set it on the counter, telling herself she would call later if the feeling didn't pass. By 4 in the afternoon, Patricia had picked up her phone 3 separate times and put it back down, telling herself she was overthinking it, that a woman she had met once for 90 minutes back in March was not her responsibility, that there were 100 reasonable explanations for the feeling in her chest. She almost talked herself out of it a 4th time. And then, at exactly 47 minutes past 4 o'clock, sitting alone in her kitchen, with her coat still on from running errands, Patricia Hensley picked up her phone one final time, scrolled to the number she had saved but never used, and pressed call, having absolutely no idea what she was about to interrupt. Patricia did not have a plan when she pressed call. She had no idea what she was going to say if Diane picked up, and an even smaller idea of what she would do if Diane didn't. The phone rang twice, then 3 times, and Patricia found herself gripping the edge of her kitchen counter, watching the seconds pass on the screen, feeling something tighten in her chest that she still cannot fully explain to this day. On the 4th ring, there was a click. A long pause followed, the kind of pause that carries weight even through a phone line, and then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, Diane Whitfield said hello. Diane would later say that answering the phone was not a decision. It was closer to a reflex, the same reflex that had made her answer thousands of ordinary phone calls throughout her life, without thinking twice about it. She had the pill bottle open in her lap. She had not swallowed anything yet, but her hand had been resting on the cap for several minutes, turning it slowly, working up to something she had rehearsed in her mind more times than she could count. When the phone rang, some small, automatic part of her simply reached over and answered it, the way she had answered thousands of calls from telemarketers and old friends and her son checking in. She did not expect it to be anything other than ordinary. Patricia's voice on the other end was warm, unhurried, and completely unaware of what it had just interrupted. She said Diane's name, then reminded her who she was, the woman from the support group back in March, in case Diane had forgotten. She said she had been thinking about her. She said she hoped that was all right to say, calling out of nowhere like this. For a moment, Diane said nothing at all. She sat there on the edge of the bathtub with the phone pressed to her ear and the pills still in her lap, and she felt something crack open inside her chest that she had spent 11 months welding shut. What Patricia said next, she has repeated many times since, in interviews, in her support group, to Diane herself on the anniversary of that day. She asked a simple question, the kind of question most people ask without expecting an honest answer. She asked Diane how she was really doing, not the version people give at church or at the grocery store, but the real one. And in the silence that followed, a silence that stretched on long enough that Patricia almost asked if the call had dropped, Diane Whitfield made a decision that would end up mattering more than any decision she had made in the 11 months before it. She told the truth. She told Patricia about the pills in her lap. She told her about the note folded on the counter downstairs. She told her, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, that she did not think she wanted to keep going, and that she had been sitting there for the better part of an hour, trying to find the courage to finish what she had started. Patricia did not gasp. She did not panic. She did not launch into a lecture about all the reasons Diane had to live, the way well-meaning people so often do, the way that so rarely actually helps. She simply said one word back to her, quietly, steadily, a word that Diane would later say landed differently than anything anyone had said to her in almost a year. The word was stay. Not stay on the line, not stay alive, in the dramatic, urgent way you might expect from a movie. Just stay. Said plainly, the way you might ask someone to stay a little longer at dinner because the conversation wasn't finished yet. Diane has spent years since trying to explain why that particular word, in that particular moment, cracked something open in her that 11 months of quiet suffering could not. She believes it is because every other message she had received in that stretch of her life had been about fixing something, solving something, getting back to being fine. This word asked for nothing. It didn't ask her to be fine. It didn't ask her to explain herself. It simply asked her to remain, exactly as broken as she was, for one more minute. Patricia stayed on the phone with her for the next 90 minutes. She did not lecture. She did not hang up to call for help behind Diane's back, a decision she has since said she agonized over in the moment, knowing it carried real risk. Instead, she asked Diane to do small things, one at a time. Put the pills back in the medicine cabinet. Walk downstairs, sit at the kitchen table instead of the bathroom floor. Drink a glass of water. Each request was small enough that Diane could actually do it, and each one pulled her a little further from where she had been sitting an hour earlier. Somewhere in that conversation, without either of them naming it directly, Diane agreed to let Patricia call someone else, a crisis counselor Patricia knew personally, who arrived at Diane's house a little over an hour later. What happened in the days that followed was not a dramatic transformation. Diane did not wake up the next morning and feel entirely well. She spent 5 days in a hospital in Dayton, under observation, meeting with a psychiatrist for the first time in her life, starting a medication regimen that would take weeks to show its full effect. Her sister flew in from out of state, sat by her bed, and cried harder than Diane had ever seen her cry, apologizing over and over for not noticing sooner. Her son, Tyler, took the first flight he could get, walked into that hospital room, and simply held his mother's hand for a long time without saying anything at all, because there was nothing either of them needed to say in that moment that the silence wasn't already saying for them. In the months that followed, Diane began seeing a therapist regularly, something she had resisted for years out of a quiet shame she had never fully examined. She returned to her classroom in January, later than planned, but she returned. Her students, she says, had no idea what their teacher had survived just months earlier, and in some strange way, standing in front of them each morning became part of what kept her steady. She and Patricia spoke on the phone every week for the first year, and still speak regularly today. Diane has since said that Patricia did not save her life by saying the right thing at the right time out of luck. She believes Patricia was simply someone who had learned, through her own history of loss, to trust the discomfort of reaching out, even when logic told her not to. Patricia's own story, it turns out, is part of why she made that call in the first place. Years before she ever met Diane, Patricia had lost her younger brother to suicide, at a time in her own life when she had noticed something was wrong and talked herself out of calling him, telling herself she was overreacting, telling herself he would reach out if he really needed her. He didn't, and he never got the chance to. Patricia has said, in the years since starting her support group, that every uneasy feeling she has ever had about a person from that group afterward, she now treats as something worth acting on, even at the risk of feeling foolish, even at the risk of being wrong. She would rather make 100 calls that turn out to be unnecessary than fail to make the one that mattered. Psychologists who study moments like this one have a term for what happened on that call, something they refer to as a pattern interrupt, a single unexpected piece of language or contact that breaks a person out of a fixed, narrowing mindset long enough for other options to become visible again. But Diane does not use clinical language when she talks about it. She calls it the moment someone handed her life back to her without asking anything in return. She has said, more than once, that if Patricia had called and asked her to explain herself, or had launched immediately into reasons to keep living, she does not believe she would have stayed on the phone. It was the simplicity of that single word, the fact that it demanded nothing of her except to remain a little longer, that reached the part of her that had already decided nothing else could. Diane Whitfield is 52 years old now. She still teaches 3rd grade in the same school district outside Dayton. She still keeps her garden, and her neighbors still stop to admire it on their evening walks. Though she says she notices the flowers differently now than she used to, more slowly, more gratefully. Her relationship with her son has changed in ways she says she could not have predicted, closer in some respects than it was even before he moved away, because both of them now understand exactly what almost happened, and exactly what it would have cost. She has never remarried, and says she isn't opposed to the idea, simply that it has not been the priority she once thought it would be. What matters to her now, she says, is far simpler than it used to be. She keeps one object on her kitchen windowsill, a small stone with the word "stay" painted on it in Patricia's handwriting, a gift Patricia gave her on the 1-year anniversary of that phone call. Diane says she doesn't need the stone to remember the word. She says she will never forget it as long as she lives, but she keeps it there anyway, in a place where the morning light hits it first, because some mornings, even now, are harder than others, and having something small and physical to look at helps more than she ever expected it would. If there is a single thing Diane wants people to understand from her story, it is this. She does not believe she was uniquely weak, or uniquely broken, or uniquely unlucky in the year leading up to that Tuesday afternoon. She believes she was simply a person carrying more than she let anyone see, which she has come to understand is far more common than most people realize, especially among people her own age, especially among women who have spent their lives being the one everyone else leans on. She wants people watching this to understand that the presence of a smile, a job, a garden, a full calendar tells you almost nothing about what someone is actually carrying underneath it. Psychologists who work with people in midlife often point to this exact combination of losses: a divorce, children leaving home, the death of a parent, arriving close together, as one of the most dangerous and least discussed periods in a person's emotional life, precisely because it so rarely looks like a crisis from the outside. There is no single dramatic event to point to, no obvious warning sign that makes it into a news story. There is only a slow, quiet erosion happening behind a life that still, on paper, looks completely fine. Diane's story did not end in tragedy only because someone trusted a feeling she could not fully explain and picked up a phone she had no real reason to pick up that day. Somewhere in your life, right now, there is very likely someone who has gone quiet in a way that feels slightly different from their usual quiet. Someone who used to call more often and now doesn't. Someone whose garden still looks beautiful, whose classroom is still full of worksheets, whose choir seat is still filled every Sunday, and who may be carrying something none of that can tell you about. You do not need the perfect words to reach them. Diane Whitfield's entire life was changed by exactly one word, offered without an agenda, without a lecture, without a demand for explanation. Sometimes the smallest, simplest thing you can say to someone is the only thing large enough to reach them. If this story moved you, we would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Is there someone in your own life you have been meaning to reach out to? Someone who has gone a little quieter than usual? Sometimes writing it here, even just to yourself, is the first step toward actually picking up the phone. And if this story stayed with you, we have another one coming soon that we think you will not want to miss. About a letter that sat unopened in a drawer for 40 years, and the family it finally brought back together. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. And thank you, sincerely, for staying with us through this one.